In this week's In-Ear Insights, we are talking about use cases for generative AI and large language models, as well as, kind of what's new. You literally can't go a week without the entire universe of generative AI changing. So, Katie, what kinds of things did you have in mind that you wanted to know more about, given how fast everything's changing? And full disclosure, by the time you listen to this all might be outdated.
I think that, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but I feel like generative AI. So first of all, I didn't know that was the proper terminology for all of this, but it makes sense. I understand what generative means in this context. I guess the thing I'm trying to understand is this is all really cool and fascinating technology, but in my day to day as a marketer, what are the things that I need to know? So we have like two systems. If we want to just take as an example, there's ChatGPT, and now there's ChatGPT 4 or GPT 4. And again, sort of like I'm probably going to mix up the terminology, and it's just hard to keep track of. So the real question is, what's a use case for a marketer like me who isn't as technical, and in terms of like I can understand technology but I can't keep up with it as quickly as you can. So like, what do I need to know? What are the use cases of GPT or GPT 4? I'm already losing it.
Okay, let's tackle the terminology first, just so that
Yeah,
we're
let's
all
do
clear.
that.
So, ChatGPT is
Yeah.
a web-based interface that allows a human to talk to a large language model. For those who are paying customers, when you first sign in, there's this little drop down that says, here are the models that are available. There is GPT 3.5 Turbo, which is the current one that you probably will use the most. This model is very fast. It is good at what it does. It is not the newest, but it is still fairly new. There is the older version 3.5, which is what's available in the free version. It's slow, but it still does a decent job. And then there's the brand new GPT-4. So this is the latest and greatest model. It can do much more complex reasoning and logic. It does a better job of summarization. It does a better job kind of understanding what you're asking of it, and 40% fewer hallucinations, which means just, is a polite word for lying. It is it is also slow because of that. Here's what makes these models different. They're all trained on different numbers of amounts of text with different numbers of parameters. And a parameter is, take your average sentence, right? What are the statistics, the word frequencies in that sentence, right? If I say, I pledge allegiance to the next logical word based on a whole bunch of text is probably the word flag, right? So there would be a probability score attached to that word. Every time one of these models gets made, you'll hear people say, like, this has 700 billion parameters or 6 billion parameters, whatever. All that means is there's that many more probability scores. GPT-4 is about 10x the size of previous models, which means that it has the ability to guess better at what the next word or phrase or sentence or idea or concept is. It's just better at guessing because it has more previous examples in terms of probability to guess from. So that's the big difference. You have ChatGPT, the web app that we talk to. It's one of the two ways to talk to this thing, beside the other being an API. And then there are 3 models within ChatGPT that you can choose from, depending on the use case. Today, GPT-4, if I select this, has a cap. It says, hey, you can only use 25 messages every 3 hours because the system is really struggling to keep up. So again, for most people who are on the paying plan, you're going to use the 3.5 turbo model because there's no usage caps on it, and it will do 95% of what the version 4 model can do at much faster and with no annoying messages.
So if you are 4.5 minutes into this podcast with us and you are like me and fighting really hard to not let the cymbal crashing monkeys in your brain take over this conversation, what I've heard so far is that ChatGPT is the interface, and that the models that live inside, there's currently 3. There's the legacy, there's the default 3.5, and then there's the brand spanking new version 4. And I think what it comes down to, in terms of which model you would use within the ChatGPT interface, is what your use case is. Depending on what it is you need to do, the legacy system or the current 3.5 may be good enough, especially if you're doing something like rewriting content or generating a first draft, especially if it's on something as general as, you know, what is SEO or what is digital marketing. The older systems, the older versions are good enough to get you started. You still have to have that domain expertise regardless of what you're doing with ChatGPT, but the older systems are good enough for that. Um, Chris, I know you've looked at, and OpenAI has published use cases and how people are using these systems. And so we know that, drafting new content or summarizing or rewriting content are some of the most common use cases. But what can what can GPT-4 do that 3.5 can't do?
4 has better reasoning skills.
Mm-hmm.
The example given in the demo, it was given a bunch of tax code, like tax laws, assess what the standard deduction for a person would be under a specific scenario. And because, again, it has many more parameters, which means it has many more abilities to guess, it guesses correctly much more of the time. Another example given in the white paper that was released is it passed the bar, it passed the AMA's medical exam, it passed the SATs with flying colors, it passed the LSATs, because it has the ability to do more reasoning, more logical deduction on the text it's given, to the point where it can actually do some really interesting stuff. There's 4 big things that these models can do. One is make new stuff, generation,
Mm-hmm.
right? Second is summarization, like
Mm-hmm.
concatenate. Third is rewrite, like take something old, make something new. And the fourth that people don't talk about is transformation. How do you
Okay.
transform one type of input data into another? Again, because the 4th edition of the model is bigger and heavier, and has more capability, it can do more complex versions of these 4 big tasks.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the older models can do it reasonably well. And let me show you an example of a transformation. So this is kind of a fun one, and I'll use the 3.5 model because it's good enough for this. I'm going to give this thing a bunch of lyrics, just lyrics, and I'm going to have it generate guitar tabs. So it's going to generate essentially taking the chords for guitar and then spitting out guitar tabs. Now, if you're a guitar player, you can take this output and start playing guitar with it. I am not a guitar player. This means nothing to me. I actually had to have a friend who plays guitar look at this and play it. And I'm like, wow, that really sounds good. It's not what the original song was.
Mm-hmm.
I just gave it lyrics and it essentially made up notes to go with it. But it's transforming one type of text into another. And so that's the aspect, the major use case that people don't think of. They think of very simple transformations. Hey, rewrite these song lyrics to be about this kind of thing. But they think about changing different types of media. In version 4 of the model, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, it's not available in the ChatGPT interface. It's only available through the API, which means software has to do this. Additional software has to do this. You'll be able to pass it an image, and it'll be able to take what's in that image and transform it back into text in some way. So obvious use cases, caption this photo, right? Less obvious use cases, here's some sheet music, write some new stuff. Or here's a picture of the spike protein of the influenza virus. Devise a protein sequence that could potentially bind to the antigen receptors on this, right? Because there's so much more information contained in images than there is in text. There's the old cliche, a picture is worth 10,000 words. That's literally true. It would take you 10,000 words just to describe the shape of a spike protein, whereas you can just give it a picture and say, okay, now work with this. We don't know how it's going to perform because it's not open to the public yet. We don't know what it will be capable of, but those are some of the ideas behind it, about especially what's different about the bigger model.
It's interesting because, we started off talking around about the use cases for marketers, but what I'm hearing is you still have to be a subject matter expert. So you're giving this example of, one of the underutilized use cases of the GPT system in general is transformation, but you yourself can't read guitar tabs. Now, I happen to be able to read guitar tabs. That's a little fun fact. And so for someone like me, this is actually straightforward, but you didn't know that about me. And so therefore, you went outside somewhere else to find an expert who could help you understand this. And so that then takes up more resource time. If you don't have someone in your friendlies network, you might have to bring in an expert and that may cost you money. And so thinking about the use cases for marketers, first and foremost, you need to be able to use these systems within your area of expertise. And so if we think about the common use cases, so, you said the four basic use cases are generate, summarize, rewrite, and transform. And so if we think about generate or rewrite, you know, if you have a piece of content or you want to generate a piece of content around SEO, as a marketer, you first have to have a good working understanding of how SEO works. So if I said to ChatGPT, write me a 500-word blog post on the four major components of SEO, I would first have to know what those four major components are to understand if the system is giving me back something that is even close to correct.
Exactly right. Exactly right. You have to know whether or not what it's spitting out is useful or not. By the way, how does this sound? Like these guitar tabs.
Oh, you want me? I thought you were going to play something.
No. I was just like looking at this. Like I look this, and I don't know what this means.
It would take me more than a hot second to figure out how this sounds.
Okay.
I can't read them that quickly, but I can read them.
Gotcha. Yeah, so that's exactly right. And we actually have a bit of a gallery of just a few use cases. This is actually from a talk that we've just started doing. So this is the obvious one, right? Generation. You'll act as a blogger, write a blog post for a blog post outline about predictive analytics. And of course, it does that. Does it very capably, very straightforward use case. I would be surprised if people did not know that this was one of its basic capabilities. And these are true for 3.5 and 4. You're an expert social media manager. You're going to summarize this text and turn it into a YouTube caption. Right. That's one actually I use almost every week for Trust Insights because I'll take the transcript of this podcast, and say, okay, I just want you to write me a summary, a YouTube caption, so I don't have to think about it, but I don't have to do it myself. This is a fun one. I can actually do this one live. This is a form of summarization. I'm going to take this text that I'm going to ask it. I want you to write a Big 5 personality analysis from this text. Provide numerical scores on a scale of 0 to 100 for each of the Big 5 personality traits. So this is rating my writing on this personality scoring system, which I think is really interesting. Fun thing. I tried to have it do Myers-Briggs, and it's like, can't do that. Because it says there's not enough information to draw those conclusions. What it should have said is Myers-Briggs has been thoroughly discredited as a tool for actual analysis. But these are the Big 5 personality traits. So this is kind of a cool application of summarization to say, like, yeah, this is who this author is.
Interesting. I'm trying to figure out if any of this is actually true. It'll take me more than a second to figure that out. No, but I think that's a really interesting. This is where you start to get into, in terms of a use case, these systems, ChatGPT, the other ones that have come out, they're not search engines, but they are a library of information that you can pull from to summarize. And that is, there's a big difference between the two. And I think that if your use case is tell me what the Big 5 personality traits are, you're not necessarily using the system correctly because you're still using it like a search engine versus here are the Big 5 personality traits. Let me give you the information and then let me give you content to summarize to say, what are those things?
Exactly. And in terms of what you would do with this information, there is some belief in some management circles that these traits can help you, figure out who, which people are compatible to work with each other or not. I'm firmly in the camp of you make do with the resources you have, but that is a capability of the system. Other use cases, one of my favorites, writing code. So this one, I gave it some plain language instructions. Here's the code I want you to write. Go ahead and write the code for me. It gets it about between 95 and 98% right most of the time. And then there's one or two things that always break. And then again, that's where that subject matter expertise comes in. You look at it and go, oh, whoops, you forgot the semicolon here. Okay, now we're off to the races. This saves me so much time. It's this past week we were doing some work for a client building a forecasting model for their conversion tracking, and this particular use case saved me easily 8 hours. I told it what I wanted to do. It wrote me the first draft of the code, and instead of 8 hours, it took me 15 minutes to get that first draft of that code written.
Which I think is actually, that's a really interesting use case that, to your point, if you don't know what these systems are capable of, then you don't know to ask for these things to be done. But, someone like me who I know enough about coding to be dangerous, to be able to look at that and go, I understand what that's supposed to do. But I wouldn't understand the nuance to say, oh, the reason it's probably not going to work is because there's a comma instead of a semicolon, or there's not, a line break or whatever the command is. I don't know enough about it to know that that would be the fix. So for me, that's still not a great use case because I'm not a subject matter expert in code development.
Yep. This is one of the examples of integration. So this is Microsoft Visual Studio Code. I can take my code, right click on it and say, find bugs, optimize my code, explain my code. What does this code even do? Add comments to my code. This is one that I think is really important because it's something I don't do at all.
Correct.
And so for building like documentation, you could see just how valuable this would be to automatically document my code. It doesn't change it, doesn't rewrite it, doesn't change functionality. But boy, this would save you a lot of heartache.
Right. Because one of my jobs when I was a product manager was to validate that my development team was commenting their code, checking things in and out correctly. And a lot of times that wasn't happening because there was no log, there's no record of it. So, Chris, in this particular use case, you have Microsoft Visual Studio connected to ChatGPT using a GPT 3.5 database. And you're basically, instead of writing in the ChatGPT interface, you're writing in Microsoft Visual Studio, powered by the GPT database. Comment on my code. Read this thing and comment on it, or summarize this thing, or tell me what this thing does, because you're using the commands from Microsoft Visual Studio.
That's right.
Okay.
Exactly right. And this is where this stuff is going. This is what people, I think, when they ask questions like, what is the future of this stuff? It is not a fancier web interface. It is integration into other products. We already see this with things like Microsoft Bing. It has an integration into GPT-4. We see this in the announcement with Microsoft Copilot, where this thing's going to be in every part of Microsoft Office, kind of like a Clippy on steroids, or a Clippy that's actually useful. It's just it looks like you're trying to write a funeral note. Go away.
That's a very specific use case.
It's this is where the stuff is going. Is you are going to see this all over the place. We saw in a marketing perspective, HubSpot. Dharmesh Shah created ChatSpot, which is a GPT integration into the HubSpot CRM. Integration is going to be the watchword for these models. Every software company that has complex software will have to do some kind of integration into a large language model if they want to stay current. I mean, think about this. Like, imagine Adobe Photoshop. It's a complex piece of software. But the things you do in it are highly repetitive, right? Change this color balance, do this thing. That is perfect for a large language model's interpretation. Can you imagine open a photo in Photoshop. You say, colorize this, make the color a little bit warmer, remove my X from this photo, and it does the thing. And you don't have to click all the buttons but it's not like a brand new button's going to appear. The large language model should be able to capably do that. So that is something to be on the lookout for. So that was a use case. This is another favorite one. Having it do social media content, right? Super simple. However, this is done with review data. So I took data from Google reviews from my teacher's martial arts school, and I said, now write Instagram photos and captions based on the 5-star reviews. So I want to summarize in a different format, but only certain types of content.
Yeah, I feel like that the summarization, I think, is underutilized and not understood in terms of its capabilities. Because when I've heard the use cases of summarization, it's summarize these meeting notes. Tell me what the action items are. That's helpful, but that means that someone or something had to take the notes in the first place. So is that really the best use of time or the system? Because what if it gets it wrong? Whereas this, I know we used another example of a restaurant where it was very similar. They were struggling with getting quality social media posts from the agency that they were working with. And so we showed them the example of, if we could just generate samples, you could at least give that to the agency to say, this is what we would like to see instead. Because the contacts that I was working with, they're not social media experts. They know what they like and what they don't like, but in terms of generating it, putting the plan together, that's not what their skills are best suited for. And so using this summarization use case was a really good time saver, because then they could at least take the stack of recommendations from the GPT model and say, okay, based on the 5-star reviews we get, based on our website, our menu, all the things that the system quickly learned, here's what we want you to put on social for us. You haven't hit on things like, our weekly specials, our, outdoor dining, we're dog friendly, we have gluten-free and vegan options. Like, all of those things are what other people have said. And so you can then summarize it into a different form. I almost feel like this is a combination of summarization and transformation.
It is to a degree. And the reason this example is important is because it is removing a bias of the marketer, right? It is using the words and the phrases and the colloquialisms of the customers. He's using the customer words coming out the customer's mouth. There is no stronger voice of the customer than actually using the voice of the customer, right? Like, you literally using the words that the customer is saying. And these tools, again, allow you to do that transformation, do that summarization in ways that a human marketer won't, because a human marketer's bias is like, oh, we got to put in this thing. Like, no, that's not what's in the data. You can't put that in. It's not what's in the data.
For me, personally, the reason I like this is because, I am a self-admitted terrible marketer, because my inclination is always to sort of start with some kind of, quippy marketing content, like, hey, check out our brand new thing, or look at this cool cat, whatever. Like, I'm terrible at writing, short, concise marketing content. This takes a lot of that, sort of struggle of the first draft out of it, because then I can go, oh, this is a very direct caption. Discover the best martial arts school in Boston. Hey, you just said everything I was trying to say without me being overly cheesy.
Exactly right. Another example, this is what you mentioned earlier. You're an admin assistant taking unedited transcripts and producing meeting notes and action items. Again, super straightforward summarization task, but super valuable, right? Because, again, you don't need to have a VA listen to the meeting again. Even with flaws in transcription, the open AI models do a very good job of inferring what was probably trying to be said.
Right.
For example, on today's Trust Insights blog post it was Thursday the 23rd. Looking at that post, the transcript for that episode looks a little bit different because I put the whole thing through GPT 3.5 because I wanted the text to be a little more refined. And there were some weird things in the original transcript that are just gone in the cleaned up version. Now, it took a little while to do that because I have not finished writing the code to do that programmatically, but it was pretty good. This is a fun one. I got an NDA from somebody. This was on the Warrior Nun stuff, so it's not something that that was Trust Insights related, because otherwise you would kill me. And I looked at the NDA and I said, "This NDA sucks. I'm not signing this. This thing is terrible. What'd you do? Copy and paste this, from like Reddit?" And the answer was yes. The person did that. I'm like,
Yikes.
yeah.
Don't get
So
your
I
legal
said,
advice from Reddit.
I said, you will act as a legal expert, rewrite this NDA properly. And it did. And then I asked it, several follow-up questions. What clauses are missing that are most commonly found in other NDAs? And it went through and it made a legally sound NDA that I then on our team, we have 3 or 4 different lawyers. And then I had one of the lawyers, the human lawyers, fact check it and say, yep, this is, don't sign that original one. It was crazy. But again, this is now a rewrite of existing terrible content that has very high risk, right? If you sign a bad NDA, you're at substantial risk.
Well, and that goes back to, and I feel like, there's certain things that we always sort of become broken records about. And so the 5 Ps is a broken record, but there's a reason for that. And now with all of this generative AI, it's, the use cases are cool, but you have to know what you're looking at. You have to be a subject matter expert or know someone who is in order to fact check the information coming out of it. And so this is going to be the new, disclaimer for everything that we're talking about when it comes to artificial intelligence. And so, the question of what are the use cases for marketers, there's a lot. There's a lot that I think is not being used to what you're demonstrating, Chris. I think the most common use case is write me a first draft of a blog. Period.
Yeah, that's kind of like taking a Ferrari to the grocery store. Like, yes, it'll do that, but you're kind of underusing it.
Yeah, and I think that's so. How, and we've covered this question, but I think you asked me, so now I'm going to ask you. How does someone start to understand what these other use cases are if they don't know to ask the question?
Is it text? Like that is the broadest question I can ask. Is what you're talking about something that exists in text? Is it language? If it is, you can use these tools on it, right? Is it code? Is it music? Is it genomic sequences? Is it, take your pick. If it is text that's publicly available on the internet, it was probably consumed by these by the tools that were used to create these models, which means that you can then use those examples to get to the heart of what you wanted to do. If it's not text, then no, you probably can't do it. Or can it be represented as text? Like, for example, you can't put musical notes as a score into the GPT models, but you can also put the lettering, the notes, the notation in guitar tabs and chords and stuff, and it will spit that right back out. Think about all the things that you have used text for on a day-to-day basis. All of those are candidates to be used with a large language model. Emails, chats, those are the obvious ones. But then things like slides, spreadsheets, you name it. Is it text? It can be manipulated. You can even have the tool spit out spreadsheet compatible data that you can copy and paste in. We use this for sentiment analysis. So we wrote some code for the Trust Insights newsletter and fed it 50 posts about International Women's Day and said, give me a sentiment score between -10 and +10. It's just text. So is it text? It is fair game. A couple more examples of these use cases. Here's one: build a mission statement, right? So you act as an executive coach and a management consultant, and they give a whole bunch of background information, and then it constructs a nice mission and vision statement. So, super straightforward, but it's a form of summarization, but it's a very different kind because this mission statement is something that you're going to spend probably a lot of time on. One of the challenges that we've always had when we're talking to each other, I remember we used to have these executive strategic retreats at the old agency we worked at and spend 2 days navel gazing about our mission. And like, now let's just feed it some text and have it do the first draft without our biases, our personal emotional biases in there. You'll act as an SEO expert. Here's some background information about Trust Insights. Make an SEO keyword list, right? Again, this is a type of summarization, but it's a summarization that is semantic in nature because not all of these words were in the original text. So we can, market research services was not in the prompt,
Mm-hmm.
but it because of the probabilities. Remember those parameters. We know this. And finally, this is one for marketers to work with your legal teams. I said, make me a website privacy policy, right? Here's the tools we use, Tag Manager, Twitter, etc. Make me a website privacy policy. And I've done this. Make me a GDPR compliant privacy statement. Make me a CPRA compliant privacy statement. This is super valuable. Again, first draft, you still
Mm-hmm.
must use a human lawyer to fact check it. But I handed this off to this is again for the Warrior and stuff because I trust and say we do use actual lawyers, but for the volunteer organization, I ran this through. I had the lawyer look at it, and the lawyer was like, how did you do this? Because this would save me so much time at work to get that first draft. I'm like, well, let me show you the joys of AI.
Mm-hmm.
So these are sort of the abridged examples of business relevant use cases. There are so many more that are non-business use cases or non-marketing business use cases as
Right.
well. But guitar tabs,
Mm-hmm.
lyrics and limericks, and fan fiction. But I think
Well,
these.
I was
Go
going to
ahead.
say one of the things that I can think of is, academic research, medical research, summarizing. If you've never experienced the joy of reading an academic paper, and I say that somewhat sarcastically, they are long and dense, and sometimes, if you're not an expert, hard to follow. And the abstract that comes along with it doesn't always tell you exactly what the thing, what the paper, the topic, the point of it is. And so, using a system like the GPT models to summarize these really dense pieces of text to get to the meat of it is a really good use of the system because you're not asking the system to come up with something net new. You're taking existing, peer reviewed, scientifically backed information and saying, just summarize it for me. Tell me what the gist of it is. Give me the Cliff's Notes of it.
Exactly. This is this is an example that as long as it's prior to September 2021, which is when this particular model has its cutoff date, you
Mm-hmm.
could have it do just identification, straightforward identification. I asked in this case, peer-reviewed academic papers looking at dopamine systems in our neurology interacting with social media, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so there is actual academic research. We can go Google these papers and pull up these papers. So being able to navigate through a lot of scientific literature, and you would have to go and read these papers and
Mm-hmm.
make sure that they are in fact that they exist, and b that they're properly peer reviewed and appear in a credible publication like Cell or Nature or one of the other journals. But it's a great way to get. Again, it's not a search engine, but it
Right.
functions better than a search engine for complex queries where you need some reasoning that a search engine can't provide. And I think that's a really important aspect to the use cases. These tools can do reasoning that a search engine can't do.
I can see for a marketer who's rather than using the system to write a first draft, I can actually see how this system could be really beneficial in doing the research in order for you to be able to write the first draft. And so this is a really interesting take of how dopamine systems in our neurology interact with social media. That would be a really interesting article for a company to publish, a social media company specifically, so they could sort of promote their stuff. But if you're talking about this, you want to have some research behind it. And this is a really great way to start that research process so that you can then cite, here's the latest research on this that backs up the case that I'm making. In a more straightforward example, Chris, what would it look like if you were to say, what are the most authoritative blogs about SEO in 2023? Is that the type of question that would be appropriate for a system like this? Do you think it could work?
It would work. You would want to use something that has more timeliness because, again, the OpenAI
Okay.
model stops at September 21. So what
So if you
are the
go to a
most
system, so if you're not watching this, Chris is going to Bing. which similar to we were talking about with the Microsoft, don't tell me I know this, the Microsoft Visual Studio interface that sits on top of the GPT model. Bing has made it so that their search engine interface can sit on top of the ChatGPT model as well. So, in the use case that I'm giving, if you're a marketer who wants to write about the best resources for SEO blogs, you could go to Bing, powered by GPT, and say, what are the top, most authoritative blogs about SEO in 2023? And so what I'm looking at on the screen is a quick list of blogs that I'm familiar with. And so as someone who has some subject matter expertise, I'd say, yep, I trust the Moz blog. I trust Search Engine Watch. I trust Search Engine Land. I trust the Neil Patel blog. I trust Yoast. Like, those are all credible resources. And so this particular search has helped me very quickly narrow down my research.
Exactly. It's interesting as a point of comparison, and this is something that marketers should be aware of. This is what Google Bard spit out, right? Webmaster Central, Search Engine Journal. So it's a very similar list. Here's the big difference. None of this is clickable at all, right? These are citations that you can hover over and boom, you're ready to go. Feed spot, you can look at the different sources that it's pulling from. So if you are a marketer who does a lot of SEO, this is a problem, right? Because I'm asking Google questions and it's giving me answers and it's not sending traffic anywhere. And for a result where you would think the logical thing to do would be provide clickable links so I could go check out each of these blogs, right?
Right. Nope. Especially if you're using Google, the automatic thing is, okay, Google's the biggest search engine. I must be able to click on these things like I can using Google.
Exactly. And when you click on the Google it button, all it does is give you a query that you then have to go and actually click to Google it. I'm like,
well, yeah. And that's a terrible, now you're just going around in circles.
Exactly. When we talk about ChatGPT or large language models in general and their risks, one of the risks to marketers is that these things consume a lot of unbranded search traffic and don't give us any in return, right? So they consume our content, but they don't send us traffic.
Right.
So this has been a very, very long episode of the Trust Insights podcast, but we wanted to go through these use cases. And again, one of the things that I think this is a good parting statement, you should be creating your own binder, your own collection of prompts that work well for you, because you're going to discover more over time. You're going to trade them like Pokemon cards or whatever, but with other marketers. But you want to have a record of them so that you can keep getting better and better at these systems.
Yeah, because the things that work for you are not going to necessarily work for other people and vice versa. So, there's ways, Chris, that you have worked out writing prompts for these systems that I would probably look at and go, that isn't exactly how I would say it. I might tweak it a little bit, but then it's a good starting place. I've already know that I'll probably keep asking you until we create our own binder of things. Hey, what was that prompt? Hey, what was that thing? Do you remember that thing? And that's not a good use of your time or my time. And I can see as you get into a larger team, a larger organization who's using this more consistently, getting those things into one central place, but also so that you can get consistent results is going to be super, super important.
It's going to be super important. And I strongly encourage people to read the documentation for any of these tools. If they provide you documentation, read it. You'll be surprised at how forthcoming they are. If you've got use cases or prompts that you want to share that have worked well for you, pop on by our free Slack group. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and over 3,000 other marketers are asking and answering each other's questions and prompts every day. And wherever it is you watch or listen to the show, if there's a channel you'd rather have it on instead, go to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast. You can find us on most major channels. Thanks for tuning in. We will talk to you next time.